I've been studying and writing about and working with community organizing groups, parent and youth organizing groups, working for educational justice for the past 25 years or so, maybe longer. And the last book that I worked on was called A Match on Dry Grass, and it was some people know it was a study of 6 organizing groups across the country really working around educational justice issues. And that book was really about organizing groups, what they were doing at the local level in their localities, almost in isolation. And when we wrote that book, we did that study, we started about 10 years ago. That was actually a fairly legitimate, accurate characterization of what was happening in the organizing world at that time, that folks were pretty much doing really important work, making changes, but really separately in their local areas. But really by the time the book came out, things had already started to change. And there started to be the rise of various kinds of national formations in the educational justice organizing world. So the Alliance for Educational Justice that Jonathan is here and writes about in the book, founded around 2008, 2009 as an alliance of 24 youth organizing groups, including the Philadelphia Student Union and also Youth United for Change here in Philadelphia. The Dignity in Schools campaign, which was is a coalition of over 120 organizations that is working to combat the school-to-prison pipeline. Harold Jordan is here, was one of the founding members, I think, and original coordinating committee member for that group. So that also has a Philadelphia connection. The Journey for Justice campaign, which has been fighting privatization of education and school closings across the country, the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, which is a national coalition in which teachers' unions have tried to find ways to work with community organizing groups. So anyway, all of a sudden there starts to be a rise of a lot of these organizations. We have an essay in the book by Jitu Brown, who's the director of the Journey for Justice Alliance, talking about the hunger strike that they had at Dyett High School, which some people are nodding and know about. It was a strike that parents went on, hunger strike to stop the closing of the school. In the past, that would have been a local struggle, maybe would support locally. This time they were able to what he calls nationalize that struggle through social media and through the Journey for Justice Alliance, and actually got support across the country and around the world. For that, it put a lot of pressure on the mayor, and it was a key part of why they were able to eventually win, and Rahm Emanuel capitulated and kept the school open as a school for global green technology and global leadership. So things have been changing over the last few years. So observing this, I wrote an article about it. Usually we academics publish these things in obscure journals that no one's ever heard of, and you have to have a subscription to get to it. And that was true for this one, except that it was freely available for free download. And it was downloaded thousands of times in the first couple of months, which for us academics, that's an unusual occurrence, causes us to want to do something, to get that kind of a reaction. And so, I thought, well, I'm a professor, I write books, I'll write a book about it. And this time, I was challenged about that by some of the organizers who said, why should you write the book about what we're doing? Why don't you work with us to help us write our own history, our own stories, our own analysis of the work that we are doing for educational justice? And so for me, it was a kind of transformational turning point. It all is really done community engaged work, really partnered and collaborated with people, but still I was always that voice. And where some folks are here from our Urban Research-Based Action Network, and we're always talking about hierarchies of knowledge with professors, and often white male professors like me at the top. And so, I was, excited to try to do something differently. And so what we did was we brought together folks like Jitu Brown and also folks like Jonathan to come together and meet a couple of times, share their stories with each other, talk about what this book could really be about, build some new relationships, invited people from all different kinds of sectors of what we might think of as the educational justice movement. And the idea was to put together a book that in some ways was trying to lift up some of the most important work and lessons of the last 10 years of the educational justice movement, and to have those stories lifted up by the people who are actually making those changes themselves. Some of them, we couldn't have everybody. It was a very powerful couple of convenings. that we brought people together for. And when the second one was over and we were going to do the book, people also said, well, wait a second, these have been great. We don't often have it. We're so busy organizing, we don't often have the chance to reflect, to have deeper conversations. We're not there as a coalition. We have to do something. We're there to really share our stories and listen and have some, chance to also dream together about what the future could be. And so out of that emerged the idea that we should form a people's think tank. And so we are actually forming a people's think tank out of this, and the book is the first product of that and our engagement with you. So in good organizing fashion, we actually have a sign-up sheet. So if you're interested in signing up for more information as the think tank evolves, you can sign your name and give us your email address if you'd like. We are also inviting you to tweet out or hashtag Lift Us Up Movement if you want to today at this event, and we are collecting those tweets and also the conversation that we're having here to kind of build a knowledge base of what people are interested in. So that was hashtag Lift Us Up Movement if you want to do that and be part of that process. So that's kind of the story of how the book came together. The book itself has a kind of, we were talking about arcs earlier, it has a little arc through it. So we were trying to think about, well, what do we need to do to build a stronger and more effective educational justice movement? So the first part of the book says, okay, the movement has to really be centered around the experiences and the leadership of those who are most affected by educational injustice. So students and parents and families, particularly in low-income communities of color in this country. And so the first part of the book is essays by parents and young people who have about their experiences in schools and with education and how their development as organizers and leaders in their community and the campaigns that they've led and their reflections and what they've learned and what kind of lessons they want to hold up about that. So that's the first part of the book. And then we say, okay, that's true, that's the center of the movement, but we also need broader alliances. So we have the second part of essays by people like Jonathan and others, or Jitu Brown, who are trying to build these kinds of alliances and build national level support for and lift up local struggles and strengthen them. And then the third part says, okay, that's all true. You have the core of the movement, you have alliances, but education is something special. We can't force teachers to teach well. We really need an internal transformation about what's happening in our schools. And so educators really need to be part of this movement. So the third part of the book is essays by teachers and teacher activists in schools, also in higher education, and scholar activists, different kinds of ways that educators are struggling to organize their fellow educators and find ways to ally with young people and parents and organizers in communities of color in the movement. And then the fourth part and last part of the book says, all right, that's all great, but you know what? We're still not really going to be able to transform public education to really challenge the systemic inequities in our public education system only within the four walls of the school, because the failures of our public education system are really rooted in larger systems of inequities along race lines, along class lines, and it's really about the lack of power that low-income communities of color have, and we really need to think in a much broader way about other allies that need to be part of that movement. So we have essays in the last part of the movement by people who are talking about, for example, in the labor movement. We have an essay from folks in the Building Skills Partnership that works with the Janitors Union in Los Angeles. And the title of that is, janitors are parents too. Mm-hmm. And if you are a union of janitors who are made up mainly of immigrant, mostly women, where do their kids go to school? They're in some of the most poorly resourced and failing schools in Los Angeles. And so if you really are a union serving your members, you have to address what is at the topmost oftentimes of their minds, which is wages and hours, but also the education that their children are receiving. So they've actually negotiated in their contracts time off for parents to take to go into their schools for parent activities, but also to take parent advocacy classes to become part of a larger education justice movement. And so they train janitor parents to be trainers for other janitors in parent advocacy and educational justice. So these are just some, and so we are trying to talk about, this is not just a set of ideas. This is real people who are in organizations building movement and lift up those to inspire other people to take action where they are. And we kind of close the book by saying, we're trying to think more intersectionally, more connected across movements, and we really believe that the educational justice movement really can be at the heart of a broader social justice movement in this country. Education is not just an issue that people care about. It's a fundamental institution of American democracy. It is fundamental to the struggle of people to liberate themselves, going back at least to the struggle of African American slaves for the ability to read. And it's about the cultivation of our next generation. It's fundamental to that. And so we ask at the end of the book, are we, as our next generation, are folks going to be cogs in a capitalist economy working low-wage jobs for the rest of their lives? Are they going to be fodder for a prison industrial system? Or are they going to become change agents in their lives and in their communities and the next generation of social justice warriors? And so with that spirit and that challenge, I'm going to turn it over to our panel, let Jonathan talk a little bit about his essay and the work that he does working with youth organizing groups, and then we'll move down the line. So thank you very much.
All right. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Good evening.
All right. Again, my name is Jonathan Stith. I'm the National Director for the Alliance for Educational Justice. AJ is a 30-member network of groups, youth-led and intergenerational, who came together who have been organizing to end the school-to-prison pipeline. Came together in 2008, thought we saw an opportunity with the new Obama administration and groups, local groups that felt like they had built up enough cred on the ground that they could influence the Department of Education. And so though we started there, I think the arc of our story and kind of where we are now kind of shifts in Philadelphia as a city and as a site of struggle, played very important national significance in the development of the Alliance. So again, part of the beginning of the Alliance, Youth United for Change, the Philadelphia Student Union were two of the founding members of the Alliance, and helped, very strong critical roles in helping to shape some of the agenda and doing some of the early organizing. For me as a youth organizer in DC, Philly was also this site, kind of a training ground. So we would get young people, we'd throw them in the car van and make the trip up to Philadelphia, see Braxton at the time, a young Eric Braxton in the Philadelphia Student Union, to kind of learn how to do organizing, them along with the Baltimore Algebra Project. So a lot of the alliances coming into formation were a lot of relationships that had been built over years between organizations and groups. And then for us, as we begin to do this work with the Obama administration, the world begins to kind of shift, right? And the first thing, the house flipped on us, right? So anything that we thought we were going to do around No Child Left Behind seemed to end, right? And so then we became this alliance that was really working closely with the Department of Ed to try to be a critical ally. And try to push them around the school-to-prison pipeline, to acknowledge it, to disavow zero tolerance as a policy, and then also for young folk, then this came the rise of kind of calling for restorative justice, right? And the call for restorative justice came out of some of the early work here in Philadelphia, right? And Philadelphia and young people here in this city were one of the first sets of early adapters around restorative justice. It was also one of the first sites that we began to also understand state violence, right? And part of the story of the Philadelphia Student Union and restorative justice is they came out of this nonviolent schools campaign idea of kind of naming state violence as government power. But they didn't call it government power that hurts and harms. That's how we defined it. But from that evolution, they were defining structural violence as a precursor and a predeterminant to what young people experience as youth violence. You don't meet young people's needs. Young people go to meet those needs, right? And sometimes in not ways that we think are appropriate, right? And so what are the proper ways to do that? And so they did a whole campaign around that to try to win that, and they got met with more police. And so as we're traveling and happening, part of our story is Trayvon Martin and the story that happens there. And we part of my chapter talks about George Carter III, who was a young person in New Orleans who was killed in an act of intercommunal violence on his way to school. His community, like Philadelphia, was marred by privatization. When he came back, they never opened, after 5 years of being back in his community, they never opened his neighborhood school back, right? And so George was killed in an act of intercommunal violence on his way to school in an overgrown field. 7 a.m. in the morning, he was shot by another young person and killed. And so for us, that was really tragic, but then it was also the criminalization of his death, by the New Orleans Police Department, that really laid a really concrete understanding of what was happening with Trayvon. And so again, Philadelphia plays a particular role in that, because then what we see a couple of years later is then the death of Portia Massey, right, which is the 12-year-old middle school black girl who died from an asthma attack because the system had decided that no nurses, right? So for us, that comes 2 years before a fight around the massive school closings that were happening in 2012, where again, Philadelphia plays a really critical role in forming Journey for Justice, which is the parent alliance. So in the first time in youth organizing history, you had the youth groups organize the parent groups for education justice. And so Philadelphia shares that mark. And then for us, so then that happens, Portia Massey dies. For us, that was about beginning for us in this movement, a moment of Black Lives Matter, right? How do we begin to identify the state violence that is happening against black children in schools? And so Portia was a clear example of that. And then even clearer was the next year that the Philadelphia school system decided to double down on police officers, right? Adding no more nurses. And then 5 months after the assault at Spring Valley in Columbia, South Carolina, where former officer Ben Fields was videotaped by Naya choke slamming Shakar, another student, we had the assault of Brian Burney at the assault at Ben Franklin. And so for us, not only did we understand kind of what was happening in Spring Valley, but we began to also understand how it was beginning to touch groups in the Alliance, right? And then from really that moment, we've seen 6 other AJ cities have assaults. We've been in the work of documenting these incidents of school-place violence. And so part of what is exciting in that work is, again, Philadelphia plays this really critical role. They were one of the first cities that we've seen actually take a rapid response incident and assault at, be able to create a campaign to win some systemic changes, right? And it became the second school district in the United States to have a complaint system against police officers, right? So then part of then kind of where our work is now today, and part of what I hope they'll talk about is our report, We Came to Learn, which begins to talk about the history of school policing in the country. Again, the cover is from Philadelphia. This is, I think, 1960s when Rizzo sent out the police to break up a black student protest. And part of what our work here is now around police-free schools, in our study of history, we found that we weren't the first students or the first set of young folk or the first set of organizers to call for police-free schools. So they've been calling it for the 50s and the 60s. So the report begins to really document that, to try to challenge the narrative around police in our schools, how our schools are policed differently from white schools, and then also begin to document the fight that youth organizing groups that you'll hear in the stories have been waging to really win police-free schools. And so I'm going to stop there, because as a good youth organizer, I know when to shut up and allow others to take the show.
Hey, so hi everyone, my name is Kameron Copia. I'm 17 and I'm a senior at Central High School, and I've been a member of the Philadelphia Student Union for 2 years now. So I've done a lot of work surrounding school safety, but when I first joined, The first thing I participated in was actually testifying at a city council meeting surrounding the reform of the school board. Basically, I was there, to, bring attention to the need for more student voice within the school board. Luckily, that need was halfway met. We now have 2 students that are on the school board. They don't necessarily get an official vote, but they are there and their voices are being heard. So that's important. I'm glad I was a part of that. So as I've said before, most of my work was within the school safety campaign. So I guess I was a speaker at the March for Our Lives here in Philadelphia. I talked a lot about the work that Black and brown youth in Philadelphia have done surrounding gun safety within our communities before the Parkland Incident. And I also touched on the school to prison pipeline. I've done radio shows, interviews, just a lot. And I'm really it's kind of crazy because I've never really thought that I would be in this position right now, representing so many of my peers. I'm just glad that I get to play a part in bridging the gap between young people and our power, because a lot of the time we're taught that we don't know enough, we're not important, we don't have a voice, be quiet, pay attention, listen. But what we have to say is just as important as what adults have to say. Yeah. So I'm just happy that I joined the Philadelphia Student Union. I'm so happy that they kind of just shaped who I am now, and I'm just really thankful for that. So, yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful, thank you. And Sadia is going to, I forget if we said earlier that Julian was supposed to be here. The executive director of Philadelphia Student Union had a family emergency, so he sends his apologies, and Sadia is graciously willing to step in unprepared to share some of her thoughts and reflections.
Yes, hi everybody. As was shared, I'm Sadia, so I'm part of this new staff of organizers at PSU who are thinking about how to carry on the legacy of the work that started in 2016 with the assault of Brian. I always think it's ironic, and I'm so empowered when I sit next to Kameron and a lot of our amazing youth who have the courage to sit here, right? As scary as that is as youth, right? To constantly be told you don't have voice, you don't have power, do as you're told and everything. And I always think it's ironic how I came into this work, because I was always very jealous of my friends who went to school in Philadelphia, because I barely remember when I was younger. My mother removed me from Philadelphia and moved us out to the suburbs in Delaware County after a family tragedy. So that happens. I'm growing up in this high school where a lot of the folks don't look like me. A lot of my teachers don't look like me. A lot of the curriculum doesn't reflect any of my history and my culture. And I remember feeling very angry that I couldn't understand why I couldn't go to a school that was well resourced, that had folks that looked like me, or why my mom had to make the decision to either have us in a community where we were surrounded by folks, Black and brown people, right? That reflected that, but also go to a school where we don't have to think about school police presence, we don't have to think about inter-community violence, we don't have to think about not getting into our top choices for college. So I always feel so humble sitting next to folks like Kameron, because they, you are the epitome of what I wish I could have done in high school, right? What I wish I could have articulated. So as this sort of personal arc of mine, right? So when I come into this work, in 2017, how old am I? 2017, and I hear this story. I sit down at my first meeting with youth and I hear the name Brian Burney for the first time, right? And before I fully understand, I understand policing as a community issue, right? But to actually think about it within the lens of education, and I hear his name and I hear the story, right, of how this young junior in high school, right, he's at the end of his long day, like one of the last periods of his school day, trying to get access to a bathroom, and that experience of just relieving himself in a human moment required police presence, right? So having to go to a school where the cops have access to the bathroom because there isn't support staff, there isn't like a hallway monitor, there isn't another youth, there isn't anybody, or there isn't even just a policy of the bathrooms being open and unlocked, right? So I hear this about this young person who goes to the bathroom, is told that he can't have access because he doesn't have a hall pass, right? And he could say a bunch of things. He could say, I have a medical condition where actually I really need to, regardless of this. He could say, well, you know what, I really just need to go. Can we like work something out? I don't know. Can we talk about this, right? He could have did a series of things, but he responded like any human being would, right? With being, having to have a debate about this one simple thing, right? Already going into a school and in a community where Black and brown people know, right? This is just an experience that is normalized at this point. It doesn't feel natural, but it is the reality. And is met, right, with violence in this one moment, right? So I hear this story, I hear about the youth, right, who didn't just say, man, that's crazy, we just gotta, whatever. We just gotta go through our next day, right? Youth who actively chose to disengage with that narrative, right? Youth who decided to say, you know what, this is a moment where we need to step up. We don't need to wait until another person of color dies dealing with police. We don't need to wait for, say, the next SRC meeting to bring it up. This is an active moment for us to step into our leadership and to think about how power needs to be shifted, because we're the ones impacted by these decisions around who guards the bathroom doors, how many nurses are in our school, whether or not the libraries are open, whether or not we have a teacher who's going to be consistently present in the classroom, whether it's a teacher who cares enough to build a relationship or has the capacity to, right? This is a moment where we're not going to ask for permission. This is a moment where we're going to step into our own leadership, right? And I'm hearing and meeting these youth who have the courage, right, to think about how do we build with other youth across this country? Where do we plug into that? How do we assess our power, and how do we assess the dynamics of power within education? How do we assess the contradictions, right? Where we as youth are told that we're in this learning environment. We need to practice respect. We need to have all these different values that we always uphold loosely in conversation, but then we don't see it being carried out, especially with Black and brown youth, right? Violence is the last resort, right? That's what we're taught. But when it's someone with a gun, right? Somehow that rhetoric goes out the window, especially when it's our lives involved, right? So I'm hearing this work, right? And I start engaging with youth like him and who are thinking about how do we create accountability with the school district, right? A school district who says, you know what, we're partners with parents, we're partners with youth, we're partners with educators. We want to think about how we build relationships so that, youth and parents can be involved in education, right? We're all impacted by this, right? But there's a closed door policy on how we actually talk about what we want to see, right? The meetings that happen often are around times where youth or parents can't be present, right? How do we do that? Or when it's available, right? There's so many other different issues that are going on in our communities that limit our ability to really not only be present physically, but mentally. How do we shift that as youth, right? We're constantly told that we need to prepare to be adults, right? But then when we're ready to step into it, now we're troublemakers, or now, we're disturbing the peace. We're all these different rhetorics, right? So coming into that, right? And then stepping into this new series of their work, right? So originally, this complaint system, after a year of organizing, after a year of having vigils, after a year of doing press conferences, and being very intentional about having meetings with the leadership of the school district, right? Okay, a year later, the complaint system goes into place. Cool, great, right? We got it, we won. Not really, right? This complaint system is created, but now youth aren't actually the ones who are included in the process of making sure it's implemented, right? Because policy can change overnight, But if there isn't any gatekeepers, right, who aren't just the ones who are the decision makers, but the ones who are experiencing the decisions that are being made, right? How do we make sure it's actually being implemented, right? So how do we make sure that we are tracking what's happening in schools, right? It's not just a complaint system. How do we make sure the schools know, right? How do we make sure teachers know? How do we make sure students know? How do we make sure parents know? How do we make sure that people have equal access and opportunities to understanding why this is important, but why this is just step one, right? And having this complaint system, right? Now that that's in place, how do we actually create programs that limits the need for police? Right? And not in any sort of nuanced way, but in a way where it's like, how do we actually create programs that allow teachers and students to build relationships, right? Because we have these two major groups, right, who are dealing with different impacts of the limits of what they can do and how they can engage, right? So part of the work that we're doing now, and part of the work that Kameron is so instrumental in leading on, right, is how do we engage spaces for more youth to just be able to be in a room and to talk about in a comfortable and natural way what they experience, right? How do they name the dynamics that show up in school, whether it's racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, right? All these things that don't just happen between students, but also happen with educators and administrators, right? How do we create these conversations? How do we give youth the opportunities to not just talk about it, right, but to be able to do things like what Kameron did, right? Being able to step in front of an audience and to lay out a speech, right? Being able to articulate what's going on and what needs to change, right? We're also working on restorative justice programs and practices, right? How do we create these consistent programs where we're not only getting sort of trained and what loosely often becomes like sort of the fluff, oh, let's just talk about our feelings work, but how do we get really honest and naked about like some of the things that are playing out, right, at home, right? Kids having to come to school hungry and expected to nail all these tasks with language that's difficult to understand. How do we get really close and comfortable with thinking about how this campaign extends beyond just what happened to Brian? It encompasses that, right, and lifts that up. But how do we make sure this issue is something that really caters to the need to exploring how our schools become safe and trusting again? And as a youth organizer, I feel like that's a good place to drop that period.
That was beautiful. Okay, thank you. So now we'd like to hear what's on your mind. Do you have questions or reflections or comments of your own contributions to make?
So I go to a lot of discussions that have to do with, public schooling in Philadelphia, and the number one thing that people talk about, of course, is resources. That the Philadelphia School District just does not have the resources to provide an adequate education for all of the children and youngsters in the system. But here tonight, I'm listening to a conversation in which there's much less emphasis on the money part, and there's a lot more emphasis on the kind of structure of the social interactions and the conversations and the relationships between students and teachers and administrators and police and so on. So my question to y'all is, do you think that should take precedence, that set of discussions about how we're relating to one another inside schools? How teachers are relating to cops, how cops are relating to students, how students are relating to each other and to the so-called authorities and so on. Is that your first priority before we get to talking about the money part of schooling?
I'm sorry, my mouth thinks to respond immediately. So thank you for pointing that out, because that is also a layer within within some of the demands that came out of this initial campaign. So we believe that we can't have a conversation about what the content of the relationships look like in schools. That can't happen without a conversation on the funding piece, and that's also a big piece that in my sort of arc trailing Also want to include, a big piece that came out of the initial campaign was thinking about how do we create a divestment piece with thinking about how do we defund, how do we remove this prioritizing of school policing and school security, right? All these things that whenever there's a conversation about what we have money to spend on, unfortunately, policing and security always becomes the meat of it. And when we think about how do we create these proactive efforts instead of just reactive and reactionary or individualized, right? If there isn't a conversation, when we talk about how do we fund for librarians and support staff and lunchroom aides and teachers, right? There's always sort of this, I don't know, we got to think about it. We got to get back to you. We're not sure we're going to have the money, right? But then when we see these incidents of mass shootings, or we see any sort of like budget meetings, right, or decision making, there isn't a hesitation with the funding for school police presence. So that's super core, right, and it's connected. I don't think it can be separated with thinking about how do you support that level of labor within schools without a divestment analysis.
Yeah.
She said.
Exactly. I think that's absolutely right. Like most of what we've seen in Philadelphia and also across the country is a kind of a two-piece, right? Or at least a couple demands, right? Focus on some levels, or at least understanding kind of restorative justice as a community control of school discipline. Right, you can understand that folks are kind of fighting for political control of their schools, and then they're also fighting for kind of economic control of the schools, and that is around divestment or where the resources go, right? So that usually does create this kind of really creative praxis where then oftentimes young people's they get told that they have to come up with the solution to their own oppression, right? So a lot of what you see then is then their answer. Then they're like, well, then since school discipline is racist and discriminatory, this is what we want and this is how much it costs, right? And so it does kind of set up a challenge. And then I do think part of, again, kind of the book and kind of working across alliances, I think there are other spaces where then youth organizing groups kind of enter into larger coalitions to help move that stuff, right? So for the Alliance for Educational Justice, a lot of that kind of budget work came through the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, right, which was the two teachers unions, right, and they were pushing for full funding of Title I, full funding for ESSA, and that made sense for that fight, and we were going to continue to kind of fight where our feet were, or organize where our feet were. And for a lot of young people, it started with in schools and in school discipline, and kind of those two things. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, the book, and in some sense, I think the movement or movements that are out there wasn't organized around like particular demands or campaigns, but there are different threads that go through the book. And I think one of them is around, you know, divest and invest and really creating greater resources for schools to do anything that we want to do. Another had to do with, you know, trying to develop an agenda for sustainable community schools, which costs money, which costs resources, right? To have schools that have a variety of services and strong forms of family and community engagement. There's also a thread that goes through in terms of culturally relevant education. And there's a thread that goes through in terms of what is the climate and relationships really like at school on a whole lot of levels. So, you know, I think that there's been, I think for a while, in many ways, it was clear what educational justice movement was against. You know, it was against privatization, it was against the school-to-prison pipeline, it's against policing in schools, but I think there's also an emerging, you know, positive agenda. It's always been there, but I think one that's more strongly emerging. And the thread, I think, it is about the inequities in education and challenging those in terms of resources, but it also is about the quality of education, the quality of relationships, and maybe the theme is, in some sense, community control of the resources that exist, of the curriculum that's being taught, of the way that relationships are being developed or not developed at schools. So, yeah. So I don't think they're counterposed at all, but I think there are different pieces that people are struggling to put together. Yes, sir.
So I'm just curious as to like the engagement of charter schools in the conversation about the educational justice movement. So I currently work at a charter school, and although like some of the issues may be different, our children are still getting policed out of schools in different ways and at greater sometimes magnitudes than that you might not hear about on the daily news that go on in public schools. So I'm just curious, like, are charter schools or charter management organizations engaged or invited to come to have a seat at the table to talk about this and getting students involved? Because I have a group of 8th graders that are really fired up that I taught last year, and now I have a group of 5th graders this year that are just empowered to want to make change, but working in a charter management organization is quite difficult at the time. So yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll let Jonathan answer this.
Right. One, I appreciate like your honesty, right? Because oftentimes when we come across folk who are in the charter school movement, they be like, that doesn't happen in the charter school movement, right? Well, that doesn't. That's why we. So to be able to actually be like, yeah, that does happen. And it does sometimes happen at a high rate. So absolutely, right? And I think that was part of some of the work that we were trying to do with the Department of Ed at the time, right? To include both charter schools and public schools. I think it's an edge that youth organizing groups are going to have to wrestle with. And like before I left to help National Coordinate the Alliance in DC, we had reached a point where 43% of DC public high school students were in charters, right? So that is 43% of my base that I need to try to figure out how to engage. And so I think that it's something to think about. I think it's really difficult. One of the groups that we work closely with in New Orleans, Rethink NOLA, they are in a system, youth organize in a system that is completely 100% charter. And it is quite the shit show for them, right? And really trying to, I think what makes kind of public education organizing somewhat doable is that a lot of times there is at least a singular target that can be moved. So whether that's a school board, whether that's a mayor, we've been able to do that. But when it's the charter, then it becomes kind of a singular school fight, and those what we've seen is like, in New Orleans, young people get like blacklisted, right? And so they get kicked out of one school or get labeled troublemaker, pushed out, counseled out, and then they find it hard to get into another school. So I don't know if y'all have any thoughts.
I would say at PSU we do like have a large percentage of students who are from charter schools. Particularly mastering. So I say that in Philly, or at least in PSU, they play a very huge part in the role that students have within this fight. I'm not sure about like how the structure and everything is different, with public schools and charter schools. But from what I've seen, from what we're doing in PSU, we're definitely all together for this one.
So you should contact Saudi to start a chapter.
Make that connection. Let me just say, it's a slightly different way than the question was. I mean, I think that it would be fair to say that I think the kind of the movement that's represented in the book is really against large-scale charterization of public education. And while I think that there are, and certainly good, important community-based charter schools that are doing some good experimental work, that the movement itself has been really taken over by these large charter management organizations that are really part of the privatization movement. And so a number of people in the book do speak to some of their organizing efforts to, for example, in Massachusetts, to stop the lifting of the cap on charter schools, to hold the number down on them, because it's seen as also taking resources away from public education. So, but we are also trying to get out of the box that it's not really about whether you're pro or against charters. the whole system needs to be transformed, and what's happening in charter schools by and large, and again there are exceptions, and there are exceptions in public education too, what's happening by and large in charter schools is not all that much different than what's happening in public education.
Yeah,
and
but I think the accountability piece is very different.
Well,
I mean, yeah,
it's less
I mean,
accountable, yeah.
you in Philly, charter schools recruit students from all over the city, right? So they're not really based in a neighborhood.
Right.
They have students coming to them from all over the place. That makes it really hard for the parents in that school to actually focus some pressure on that school because they're not located in the community.
Right.
And then as you've already pointed out, it's hard to hold anybody accountable because they aren't really directly reporting to the school board, so you can't go to the school board to complain about this. It's that accountability piece that just is missing entirely, and a lot of what y'all are saying really does have to do with accountability, you know, trying to hold the system accountable for providing the kind of educational services that we owe our youngsters. So I mean, it's just, I don't see how. I realize you want to be diplomatic.
I was trying to be restrained in my answer. All right. Thank you, though. Thank you for that, and I agree with you 100%. I was trying to be a little restrained. So, but yes, thank you, Sonia.
Well, so you know, I always think like in these conversations, you know, Sadia, you brought up the point about how you know, these interactions between students and teachers are also often very oppressive interactions, and I know the book has some pieces about teacher organizing as well. So you know, I know in recent years, you know, there's been a big movement towards social justice unionism in certain cities, where teachers unions have been forming caucuses, or there've been caucuses formed, and you know, teachers are trying to think about these sort of intersectional issues that they're contending with as educators. So I'm wondering if you guys could all speak to the role that teachers unions have been playing. And I know, you know, some of it I know the answer to, but I think it'd be really interesting to sort of hear all these, you know, people coming from very different stances talking about that, and specifically like the social justice unionism that's been emerging among teachers unions.
Yeah, I would definitely confirm that teachers unions is definitely a big piece for how we're able to do the work that we're able to do, because we have a model of like where we have chapter meetings, which are basically like in school based, where we deal with schools, the membership on like an individualized school base, and then we plug them all into our citywide space, right, to connect all these dots. And then we have like our youth leadership team. And I would definitely say, so the chapters that I work with are all in West Philly. So there we have the West Philly Working Educators Caucus, which has been super instrumental in how we're able to have access with just like on the ground meeting with students and getting them familiar with our organization, and just getting them familiar in general with seeing social justice that's focused on their specific experience, because there's all these different justice realms within the spectrum, right? But knowing that there's something specifically feasible for youth, right, that's centered in their experiences. So the teachers union has been super instrumental with bridging the gaps of the overlap, right, with thinking about how students, you know, our youth, when they're talking about, you know, being in classrooms that are cold, or being in classrooms where there's no AC when it gets hot, or having course loads that are just so overwhelming and stressful. Or having issues with other students, or having issues with other teachers, and then being able to also build with teachers and hearing from their perspective what they're experiencing from the district, where they don't have the resources, where they have to work beyond their hours to support students, or where they have to bring in their own supplies for their classrooms, right? So being able to have the Working Educators Caucus has definitely been helpful for me with being able to talk about all this overlap, right, with accountability from the school district, right, and being able to, transform this narrative, or like teachers versus students, or that sort of dynamic, really being able to get deeper into centering the experiences of Kameron and other youth when they're not able to be present in certain meetings, or when it's just awkward or difficult, right, to bridge that gap. I would definitely say it's been super helpful with getting us into the door in certain schools and just getting students and administrators familiar with who we are, and getting them to understand the work that we do and how we can work together and really be powerful together.
Well, I'll say something about that. So, you're kind of digging right in on these pressure points. I think that at our convening, some of our most heated conversations had to do with teachers and teachers unions, right? And so the vision is the alliance of teachers, activist teachers, and social justice teachers unions. We have a chapter in the book by Brandon Johnson, who's an organizer with the Chicago Teachers Union, about the transformation of the Chicago Teachers Union into a social justice union and how that was done and what it means and how they're working in alliance with communities. So we're trying to hold up models, but the reality out there is also, a lot of tension around that. I do think that, teachers unions are under attack. I mean, it's the same thing with the charters. Like, we don't want to. Sometimes we get into these debates when we're criticizing charter schools in a way that just is defending public education, and all it is defending public education the way it is. And we don't want to defend public education the way it is. We don't want it's under attack, but we don't want to defend it the way it is. Teachers unions are under attack. We want to support unions, but we don't want to defend them the way they are. They need to be transformed, and it's, I think, we could have an entire book, I think, on that topic. Both positive in terms of what has changed over the last 10 years, in part because teachers unions realize they're under attack and they need allies, but also still, the old school ways of operating and questions of power and how interest is understood by people. So I think it's a theme that comes up in the book. There's criticism of teachers and of teachers unions. There's an essay by one of the parent leaders, and the title of the essay is "I Can't Make a Teacher Love My Son," and and it speaks to some of the depth of systemic racism and the way it's also played out in stereotypes and prejudices that leads to her son being expelled from her African American son being expelled from preschool. And even after all these years of organizing and all the changes that they've made in Dayton, she ends the essay talking about her son being in 4th grade, and she still can't make that teacher love her son and really see him for who he is. And so these are, I think, really deep, tensions that that people are trying to grapple with. So, Harold, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Then in front.
Oh yeah, Maya. So I was struck by Jonathan when you're talking about the organization you started in 2008, right? And the Obama administration and everybody, and there was such this moment of excitement. And I'm wondering, sort of, now when we have a different administration, and how, if there's any potential for any good work happening in the Department of Education right now. I mean, I imagine that the answer is no, but then I think that maybe there are still I've heard some stuff about like middle level people, lower level people still kind of trying to carry out, good work in support of public schools. So I'm just curious from your perspective if that was part of your original agenda, if any of that is continuing, or is it as bad as we imagined?
It is worse than we imagined. We thought she was going to privatize the schools. What we have seen has been really scary, right? I think it feels like almost kind of a dismantling and a hardening of the school to prison pipeline, right? So again, like the kind of just the wholesale attacks on kind of transgender, LGBTQ youth, saying that ICE can be in schools, to now kind of the anticipated pullback of the federal guidance, right, which is really a reflection of young people's organizing, right, at the federal level. So, and then the dismantling of the Office of Civil Rights, which I think was a critical tactic for both Journey for Justice, the Alliance for Education Justice. Harold, I don't know how many Title VI complaints she might have filed, right? So it was a real important, right, to actually, and then we would actually get a response, right, or at least an investigation. And I would a lot of times scare the shit out of a local representative. Like, they'd rather deal then with PSU than deal with a Fed lawyer, right? So that kind of leverage, I think, is missing. And now what we see in terms of her, DeVos coming out with a budget that's gonna try to really deconstruct the Department of Education, which for Black and brown folk in this country has been one of the primary ways that we've been able to try to guarantee some kind of education justice in the face of states that don't want to do it. So yeah, it is. Yeah, I think there is a set of middle folk who are still in there fighting. But if the budget goes through the way that she wants it, they'll all be gutted to any kind of level of insignificance, right? So, sorry.
Harold.
Well, I was originally going to address this sort of union issue, and I do want to do that too. But in terms of the U.S. Department of Education, I think the thing that we expect to happen is really in the area of the school safety. That school safety report is going to come out by the end of the year, and it will no doubt have a lot of really negative stuff in it that I think is really harmful. And while generally speaking around the country, I see state departments of education and public instruction being more ambivalent about adopting the DeVos policies, I think this is one of the areas where, due to pressure from legislators, district attorneys, and whatever, that there's a real possibility for sort of increased criminalization of youth that will be more effective than a relatively incompetent DeVos administration has been otherwise. Which leads me to another point, which is the first point, is I think the place where some of the cooperation and collaboration between teachers, unions, and say our movement has sort of broken down is around the issue of school policing. And the national unions have, and I've met with all of them many times, while they have, at least during the period of time of the Obama administration, got on the school discipline reform bandwagon, at least rhetorically. It was always a situation where that was not necessarily the case at the local and state levels within unions. But if you get to the issue of policing, not even the national unions are with us on that. And in fact, one of the worst thing that's happened, and it's actually happening right now in Pennsylvania, is that some of the teachers unions within the state, as a way of opposing school staff from being armed, are calling for more professional police to be in schools, which is the official position of the state, the PSEA, the state NEA. And so that's another level of struggle that I think is going to become more serious and will be a breakdown in our collaborative relationships with teachers unions. I realize I talked a lot about a lot of different things, but I hope that makes sense.
We'll take a couple more questions. Is that fine? Okay. Jerusha.
First of all, thank you all for being here and speaking so passionately about these issues that are so important. I'm wondering if you can each talk a little bit about how you balance, or I don't know if that's the right word, toggle the responsibilities to the local organizing and the national at PSU, how you know when to lean on, when to back off the groups that are part of the alliance. And Mark, what you saw from the convenings and the work you did with all of these groups around how they negotiate that tension or set of responsibilities.
Yeah. Start on that.
This is how we balance it.
I guess I'll jump in. I was still gathering my thoughts,
Oh.
TBH.
We can come back to you.
Thank you. Okay.
It's there are, I guess the balancing was around when we were doing a lot of federal work, right? Kind of what are the kind of moments and opportunities where kind of collective action or collective push would try to move something that would create greater opportunities or greater wins on the ground, right? And that kind of has diminished under this kind of new administration, right? And then I think the balance around the local is then kind of what is as Jitu says in the book, a nationalizing a local struggle, right? What is a local fight that if amplified and lifted up, will one, inspire other folk in the alliance to maybe take up that fight, can teach us how to better struggle and youth organize, and then also would help this group win, right? And I think one of the premises as organizers or youth organizer I was trained around is that anytime I'm trying to find something or seek to change something, I always try to find who did it in the world first, right? And so kind of if this local struggle is going to be a breakthrough, we want to figure out how to throw down, how to be a support. I think some of the challenges also us figuring out that dance, right? How do we actually make offers that are useful to groups, and how groups often learn how to make requests back to us to say this is what we actually really need right now to win this fight. So,
I mean, one of the things that I've observed, I think there's different. You could have a stereotype. I think a lot of people have a stereotype or a view in their mind that a national movement is about doing something nationally.
Yeah. Right. No,
that's part of what a national movement does. But I think what's happened with the educational justice movement is also a very clear focus that a national movement is there to support and strengthen and spread and expand local struggles. And that's really a different way of thinking about what a national movement is doing. And I think that orientation, Jonathan has spoken to it about, can we identify places and go in and support them, lift up the struggles, and then other places can build on that. So you kind of get this rolling series of movement, of organizing that's built up, each one off of the other. The other thing, I think it helps answer what could be a puzzle, which is particularly in the school to prison pipeline movement, how did such a not even that large a group of fairly small, woefully under-resourced organizations, heavily, almost no resourced organizations, actually completely combat zero tolerance and turn the whole national discourse away from zero tolerance and create victories across the country at local and state levels. And part of the answer to that is the building of these national alliances and organizations that really sought to strengthen, so that you could have a group like, I was talking about Zakiya Sankara Jabbar. They're in Dayton, Ohio, a group of black parents with almost no funding, and within a couple of years got a moratorium passed on suspensions at the pre-K level, got zero tolerance taken out of the school discipline code, won the implementation of restorative justice in schools across the district. How did such a small, no resourced organization do that? And that was in part because they became part of the Dignity in Schools campaign right away and got a lot of resources support from them. So it's not only the national, it's strong local organization, but I think it's the combination of those two. And so that's, I think, what at least I've observed has been different this time about the way this movement has been built. There's been a national focus at different times, and there might still be again if opportunities open up that way. But it's also about creating this kind of network of strengthening local organizing. Thoughts on comments?
I'm not sure. I guess for me, since I haven't really been a part of the organization for that long, the Parkland Incident was one of the main focuses of last year, and that was a national, call. And basically, we just used that moment, and we found a way to identify it within our communities, and that's how we connected ourselves with that movement. So I feel like if there's a space for you to connect your own personal struggles with whatever is happening nationally, then that's how you join the two together, local and national, and that's how you make it work.
And to echo, so I think especially as a new organizer in this specific realm, that's definitely the dance or the juggle that I'm constantly thinking of, right? And being able to look at this work with two lenses, right? Obviously being connected and like grassroots organizing, knowing what's going on in schools, what's happening locally, what's happening in the communities, what people are talking about, but then constantly balancing that with being well informed of what it looks like nationally and how to plug in with folks from across the country with understanding the conditions and understanding where the overlap and the distinctions between the two, and just constantly being able to stay plugged in and to find those opportunities and those moments to be plugged and connected with other people, especially when moments like Parkland happen, or even, you know, whenever February comes around and it's Black Lives Matter Action Week, always remembering like Trayvon Martin, always remembering Sandra Bland, and always thinking about these anniversaries that constantly, obviously dealing with the things that are happening every day politically, but then also staying very connected to the folks who have passed on either the torch or who have passed literally in this work and who have become part of this long laundry list of lives who have been lost in this fight. So I think it's always that really hard like challenge and juggle, but being very intentional about doing both and not leveraging one over the other, letting one tip over too much.
Yeah. Great. Yes, sir.
Yeah. One of the things I've been noticing is there's like youth organizing, and there's like a world of actors that, as you like said, are woefully under-resourced. But then there's also like this other world of like youth development and like after school or out of school, and that, and you could talk about like that way in which the work even in those spaces has to be tied to like these standards and how is it meeting learning goals or and things to like that. And thinking about like the skills or the thing that you learn while organizing, I would love to hear like about that work, but and then on a like the larger sort of like scale, that like divide between like youth development and like all those sort of like skills, resilience, I think is a huge word over there and stuff. And then yeah, like that divide between like youth development and youth organizing, development as organizing, organizing as development. But also just about like on the ground, what are the skills and things that you learn in the practice of doing this work?
Great question.
So, personally, I could say that a year ago, I didn't really like take the time to analyze my community as much as I should be doing. So, working within PSU, you know, they always created the opportunity to, even though you do, it's considered necessary within like the school curriculum, but you don't really pay attention to what you're supposed to analyze because you don't really care about it. So in PSU, we learn about things that affect us, so that makes you care, makes you more passionate, and then analyzing situations such as Brian Burney's story and thinking, you know, about all the different aspects that play into it. I feel like that I learned how to do that more like freely. I'm not necessarily like, I don't have to be told to do that. It's just something that comes, like it's just something that's natural to me now, if you get what I'm saying. And I guess I'm better at public speaking a little bit, you know, compared to what I was before. Thank you. Compared to how I was before, I don't really know how much I've changed. I know there is a major difference. Not really sure what it is. I feel it. Can't really see it, but I know it does something. Something great. I don't know.
Yeah. Before I was a youth organizer, I worked youth development. So I was a youth development specialist. I used to train youth workers in DC, and there's a little. Some dishonesty, I would say some of the youth service organizations have, and maybe sometimes, at least in DC, was always like some cowardice, right? Like some like unwillingness to advocate or speak for children in a way that's authentic because you feel like it might jeopardize your city funding, right? That's what we would struggle under. But as I would train youth, people who work with young folk, right, it would be very clear, like one of the core competencies is being able to advocate for the kind of systems that young people need to develop, right? And so for me, that like the transition from being being a youth development specialist to being a youth organizer was really somewhat of a seamless transition, right? Like I kind of understood like this was like what this opportunity meant, what are the supports and things that need to have, and then also how to engage service organizations, because I be like, y'all got a base of young folk. I know that they're every day after school, y'all ain't doing half the time. Let us come in and do a workshop. Let us move. Y'all are clear this issue impacts you all. Like everybody who runs an after school program knows the quality of education impacts you, because you spend the next hour trying to whatever has happened to this young person in school, right? All the hurt, the harm, like you spend, right, just to detoxify before you can even get to sit down having some graham crackers and some apple juice, right? And so there is this, like, for me, I'm like, there's a very visceral connection that the quality education improves after school service, and that they have a responsibility to help do that, to help create the kind of conditions, the systemic things that young people need to grow. And that's education. Schools are the biggest youth development, youth service agency in this country, if we want to be real about it, right? Time on task, right? And so it is that kind of approach, that level of kind of seeing yourself as now, because we kind of in this new field around generative somatics and healing and stuff like that. I do think there is a space now for youth workers to see themselves as politicized youth development, like that this has a purpose, that this is grounded in some justice and what we know is right and what young people need to grow, right? So.
I will say I do think that all that, but it's also challenging because of the question of power. And I think that's really at the heart of when we're talking about building education justice movement, to building a movement to create power for folks who have been disempowered. And I think some youth development folks can be on board with that, but I think it's challenging to that paradigm which doesn't shift power or challenge power. And like we talk about the failures of public education, and but the flip side could say, well, actually, it's not a failure. It's successful at doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is to keep some people in power and other people disempowered through lack of education that then puts them in no economic power or in prison and no democratic rights. And so it's part of that larger system. And so if we're going to challenge the way that public education operates, it's really about building power for communities. That's really at the heart of it, and to invite other people to see how that's in their interest, that larger transformation of public education. And we can make those arguments because we know